A 12-year-old boy stood in a billion-dollar tech company's server room while alarms screamed. The CEO shouted to remove him. 3 hours later, that CEO was arrested, and the boy had saved everything. Jake Carson had learned that some failures sound louder than others when Apex Systems' core AI, worth $500 million and controlling data for 73 million customers, began screaming. Not metaphorically screaming, actually screaming. A high-pitched alarm that tore through the server room in Palo Alto like something mechanical was dying in agony. Red emergency lights strobed across rows of servers that held more processing power than NASA used to put humans on the moon. And every single one of them was failing simultaneously in a cascade that would cost billions if it wasn't stopped in the next hour. Jake stood in the doorway of server room C, where he absolutely wasn't supposed to be, watching 37 engineers in expensive clothes panic in ways that suggested they had no idea how to fix what was breaking in front of them. Marcus Sterling, billionaire CEO, tech industry legend, man whose face appeared on magazine covers with headlines like "The New Steve Jobs," stood at the center of the chaos looking like someone watching their empire collapse in real time. Which, Jake realized with the clarity that came from spending 3 years studying his dead father's code, was exactly what was happening. "How long until total system failure?" Marcus demanded, his voice cutting through the alarms with the kind of authority that came from owning a company worth $8 billion. 17 minutes, Rebecca Taylor said, her fingers flying across a holographic display that showed cascading errors spreading through Apex's infrastructure like a digital plague. Maybe less. The corruption is accelerating. Once it hits the primary data centers, we lose everything. Customer accounts, transaction histories, 3 years of AI learning, gone. Jake's hands tightened on the backpack he'd been carrying when he'd slipped into the building 40 minutes ago, waiting for his mother Linda to finish her security rounds. Inside that backpack was a laptop, old, battered, encrypted with algorithms that 12-year-old Jake had spent 3 years trying to crack. His father's laptop, Michael Carson's final gift to a son who'd been 9 years old when a car accident had stolen the most brilliant programmer Jake would ever know. "The stock price is already down 18%, James Rodriguez, the chief technology officer, said from his position near the main console. "The board is calling emergency meetings. If we can't stabilize the system—" "I know what happens if we can't stabilize the system," Marcus snapped. "Tell me something useful. Tell me how to fix it." Silence. 37 of the most expensive engineers in Silicon Valley. And nobody had an answer that would save $500 million, and Marcus Sterling's reputation as a tech genius. Jake saw it immediately. Saw it the way his father had taught him to see code. Not as lines of instructions, but as architecture, as poetry, as something that had intention and design and could be understood if you knew how to look. The corruption wasn't random. It was systematic, spreading through the AI's neural networks in a pattern that suggested someone had known exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage. But more than that, Jake recognized the code architecture itself. Recognized it the way you'd recognize your own father's handwriting. Because buried in Apex Systems' proprietary AI, hidden under layers of corporate branding and Marcus Sterling's signature, was Michael Carson's work. Code that Jake's father had written. Code that should have been credited to the man who died 3 years ago, but instead carried Marcus Sterling's name on every patent. "We need to shut everything down," Dr. Lisa Chen said. She was Apex's senior systems architect, one of the few people in the room who'd worked with Jake's father before the accident. "Complete system reset. It'll cost us days of work and millions in downtime, but it's the only way to stop the corruption from spreading." "Unacceptable," Marcus said. "We have a $500 million deal closing tomorrow. Investors who've been promised revolutionary AI capabilities. If we go dark now, we lose everything." "If we don't go dark," Lisa argued, "the corruption will destroy the system permanently. There won't be anything left to recover." Jake made a decision. The same kind of decision his father had probably made dozens of times in this building before Marcus Sterling's success had been built on stolen genius. He stepped forward from the doorway where he'd been invisible among the chaos, walked toward the central console, and said in a voice that sounded steadier than he felt, "You don't need to shut down. You need to isolate the corruption vectors and rebuild the authentication protocols from the primary nodes." 37 heads turned. 37 pairs of eyes landed on a 12-year-old boy in a faded hoodie carrying a backpack with duct tape holding one of the straps together, standing in the middle of a billion-dollar emergency like he had any right to be there. Marcus Sterling's face went from pale with stress to red with fury in approximately 2 seconds. "Who the hell are you? How did you get in here? Security!" "I'm Jake Carson," Jake said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "Linda Carson's son. My mom works security here, and I know how to fix your system because my father designed half of it before you took his name off the patents." The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Lisa Chen's eyes went wide. Rebecca Taylor's fingers froze on her holographic display. James Rodriguez looked like someone had just revealed that the foundation of Apex Systems was built on something deeply wrong. "Get that boy out of here," Marcus said, his voice quiet and dangerous. Not yelling. Worse than yelling. The kind of controlled rage that came from someone used to having absolute power over everyone in the room. "Get him out before I have him arrested for corporate espionage and trespassing." "Mr. Sterling," Lisa began, "if he really is Michael Carson's son—" "I don't care if he's Einstein's son," Marcus interrupted. "He's a 12-year-old trespasser who has no business being anywhere near this facility. Security, remove him. Now." 2 security guards were already moving toward Jake. But Jake stood his ground, thinking about his father. About Michael Carson spending 12-hour days in this building, coming home exhausted but excited, teaching 9-year-old Jake about recursive algorithms and neural networks and the beauty of code that could learn and grow and think. About the car accident 3 years ago, brake failure on a mountain road. Michael Carson, who maintained his vehicles meticulously, who'd passed that same inspection point dozens of times, suddenly losing control and plunging off a cliff 3 days after he discovered something wrong in Apex's codebase, something that Marcus Sterling had told him to keep quiet about. "The corruption is spreading through the authentication layer," Jake said quickly, before security could grab him. "Someone embedded a recursive virus in the identity verification protocols. It's designed to make the system eat itself from the inside out. But if you isolate the primary authentication nodes and rebuild them using the original architecture, the code my father wrote before it was modified, you can stop the cascade and restore system stability." Marcus laughed. Actually laughed. Cold and cruel and absolutely certain that a 12-year-old couldn't possibly understand what he was talking about. This child thinks he can solve in 30 seconds what 37 trained engineers can't figure out in 40 minutes. This is exactly the kind of delusional thinking that got his father killed when he refused to understand his limitations. Jake's hands clenched. My father wasn't delusional. He was brilliant. And you know he was brilliant because you've been using his code and calling it your own innovation for the past 3 years. "That's defamation," Marcus said. "Security, remove this child and contact his mother. Her employment is terminated effective immediately for gross negligence in allowing unauthorized access to restricted areas." Jake felt his stomach drop. His mother, who worked 16-hour shifts between Apex and a second job, who'd been trying to keep them afloat since Michael died, who'd never recovered from losing the love of her life, was about to lose this job because Jake had tried to help. "Wait," Dr. Lisa Chen said, stepping between Jake and the approaching security guards. "Marcus, Michael Carson was one of the most talented programmers who ever worked here. If his son really understands the system architecture—" "He's 12 years old," Marcus snapped. "He doesn't understand anything except how to repeat technical terms he's overheard. We're not wasting time on a child's fantasy while our company burns." "We're not wasting time on anything else," Rebecca Taylor said, and everyone turned to stare at her. She was pointing at her holographic display where the countdown to total system failure had just dropped to 11 minutes. "Whatever we try now, or we lose everything anyway." James Rodriguez cleared his throat. "The boy's analysis of the authentication layer corruption is actually accurate. I've been looking at the same data for 20 minutes and couldn't identify the attack vector. But if what he's suggesting is correct—" "It's not correct," Marcus said. "It's impossible. Authentication protocols are rebuilt automatically. You can't manually isolate them without crashing the entire system." "You can't," Jake said quietly, "if you're using the current architecture. But my father designed a backdoor, a way to access the core protocols without triggering the automated responses. He built it in case someone tried exactly this kind of attack." And he wrote the access codes in a letter he left me before he died. The silence was absolute. Even the alarms seemed quieter. 37 engineers watching a 12-year-old claim he held the key to saving a $500 million system that was failing in real time. Marcus Sterling stared at Jake with an expression that looked like calculation and fear and rage all competing for dominance. "You're lying. Michael never mentioned any back door. He wouldn't have mentioned it to you," Jake said. "He wrote it into the code 2 weeks before he died, after he discovered that someone was stealing his work and selling it as original innovation. He told me in a letter that if anything ever happened to him, I should keep the laptop safe, keep the code safe, because someday someone would need them to fix what had been broken." Jake unzipped his backpack, pulled out the battered laptop that had been his father's constant companion, turned it on, and entered the password he'd finally cracked 6 months ago, after 2 years of trying every combination of dates and names and phrases his father might have used. The screen filled with Michael Carson's elegant code, and at the center of it, labeled clearly, "Emergency System Recovery Protocol, for Jake, use when everything fails." Lisa Chen was already moving toward Jake, her eyes scanning the laptop screen. That's Michael's work. I recognize his coding style. If this back door is real, 9 minutes, Rebecca said. Her voice was shaking. Marcus Sterling looked trapped, caught between admitting that a 12-year-old might be right and watching his company, built on another man's stolen genius, collapse entirely. Fine. Let him try. When he fails, which he will, I want documentation of every second of this debacle. And the Carson family will be hearing from our lawyers about attempted sabotage. "I'm not trying to sabotage anything," Jake said. "I'm trying to save what my father built before you destroyed it completely." He moved to the central console, Lisa clearing a space for him, Rebecca stepping aside to give him access to the holographic controls. 37 engineers watching a child who'd spent 3 years studying his dead father's code begin typing commands that most of them didn't even understand. Jake's fingers moved across the holographic keyboard, executing the sequence his father had left for him, accessing the authentication layer through a backdoor that Marcus Sterling had no idea existed, isolating the corrupted nodes, beginning the rebuild process using the original architecture that Michael Carson had designed before someone had modified it. The system responded, slowly at first, then faster, red warnings on the displays beginning to shift to yellow, then green, the cascade of errors slowing, stabilizing, the screaming alarms beginning to quiet as Jake executed commands his father had written specifically for this moment. "It's working," James Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The corruption is contained. The primary systems are stabilizing." Jake kept working, implementing every step of his father's emergency protocol, rebuilding authentication, restoring system integrity, saving $500 million and 73 million customer accounts, while Marcus Sterling stood frozen, watching a 12-year-old accomplish what his entire engineering team couldn't. 4 minutes to spare, Rebecca said when the last warning light turned green. "System stability at 98% and climbing. We're going to make it." The server room erupted in chaos. Engineers celebrating, phones ringing with updates to the board, Rebecca already pulling up reports to document what had just happened. Jake stood at the console, exhausted and shaking, his father's laptop still open in front of him. And Marcus Sterling stood perfectly still, staring at Jake with an expression that made the 12-year-old's stomach turn cold. Not gratitude, not relief. Something darker, something that looked like recognition and fear, and the terrible understanding that Jake Carson had just proven something Marcus had spent 3 years trying to hide. "System logs," Marcus said abruptly. "I want complete system logs of everything that boy just did. Every command, every access point, every line of code he touched." "Marcus," Lisa said, "he just saved the company. He accessed restricted systems using unauthorized credentials," Marcus interrupted. "That's a federal crime regardless of the outcome. I want those logs, and I want legal review of every action he took." Jake looked at Lisa, who looked back with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand what Michael Carson had figured out 3 years ago. That Marcus Sterling's entire empire was built on stolen code, and that Jake Carson's father had died right after discovering the truth. "My father left me more than just the recovery protocol," Jake said quietly. "He left me 3 years of documentation. Every piece of code he wrote, every innovation he created, every idea Marcus Sterling claimed as his own. He closed the laptop carefully, slid it back into his backpack, and he left me a letter explaining exactly what he'd discovered about where all his work was going, who was taking credit for it, and what he was planning to do about it before his brakes mysteriously failed on a road he'd driven 1,000 times. The room went absolutely silent. 37 engineers who just watched a 12-year-old save their company, suddenly realizing they might be watching something much bigger unfold. Marcus Sterling's face had gone from red to white. That's a very serious accusation. One that could destroy your mother's career and your future. I suggest you think very carefully before you repeat slander that you can't possibly prove. I don't need to repeat it, Jake said, because the code proves itself. Every patent you've filed in the past 3 years has my father's signature hidden in the architecture. Every innovation you've claimed has his design philosophy embedded in the structure. Any forensic analysis would show that Michael Carson wrote the foundation of everything Apex Systems calls revolutionary. He met Marcus Sterling's eyes directly, channeling every ounce of his father's courage. You built a billion-dollar company on a dead man's genius, and I just proved it to everyone in this room. And Jake Carson, 12 years old, carrying his father's laptop, standing in the server room where Michael Carson had spent his final months creating miracles, walked toward the door while 37 witnesses watched Marcus Sterling's empire begin to crack. Linda Carson found her son sitting outside Apex Systems' main entrance at 11 p.m., still clutching his father's laptop like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. "Jake," she said, kneeling in front of him with exhaustion written across her face. 16 hours into her shift, and now this. Security calling her to the front desk, managers whispering. Her 12-year-old son somehow at the center of whatever chaos had erupted in server room C. "What happened? They're saying you accessed restricted systems. That Marcus Sterling wants you arrested." Jake looked at his mother and felt 3 years of grief crash over him like a wave. "Dad didn't die in an accident, Mom. His brakes were cut, and I can prove it." The words hung in the cold California air, while Linda's face went through shock, denial, and a terrible understanding that suggested maybe she'd suspected this truth all along, but hadn't let herself believe it. "Tell me everything," she whispered. So Jake did. Told her about recognizing his father's code in Apex's failing system, about Marcus Sterling's stolen patents and hidden innovations, about the emergency protocol Michael had left specifically for this moment, like he'd known someday his son would need to expose what had been taken. "He documented everything," Jake said, opening the laptop to show her 3 years of files his father had compiled, design documents with Marcus's signature that used Michael's original code, patent applications filed weeks after Michael had presented the same ideas in internal meetings, email chains where Michael had questioned discrepancies and been told to stay quiet, and at the center of it all, a letter dated 2 days before Michael Carson died. "Jake, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. Marcus Sterling has been stealing my work for 2 years. I confronted him yesterday. He threatened my career, my reputation, my family. I've documented everything, but I need more evidence before going public. I'm meeting with the board next week. If I don't make it to that meeting, you'll know why. Don't let him win. Don't let my work die with me. Love, Dad." Linda read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he?" "Because he was trying to protect us," Jake said, "and Marcus killed him for it." "That's a very serious accusation," said a voice behind them. Dr. Lisa Chen stood in the entrance, her badge still clipped to her jacket. "One that would destroy Marcus Sterling if it's true. One that would get you both sued into oblivion if it's not." Jake stood up, protective of his mother. "I have proof. 3 years of—" "I know," Lisa interrupted gently. "I worked with your father for 5 years. I watched him create miracles and saw Marcus take credit for every one of them. I suspected, but suspicion isn't proof. And Marcus has lawyers who specialize in making problems disappear." She sat down on the bench next to Linda. "Your father tried to tell me near the end. Said he'd discovered something that would change everything, but he died before he could show me the evidence. And I was too much of a coward to push harder, to ask the questions I should have asked." "You can ask them now," Jake said, turning the laptop so Lisa could see the files. "Because Dad left everything. And tonight, When I saved their system, I proved that Marcus Sterling doesn't understand the technology he's built his empire on, that it's all my father's genius wrapped in someone else's greed. Lisa spent 20 minutes reading through Michael's documentation, her expression growing darker with each file. This is devastating. The patent theft alone would cost Marcus everything. But if he really did sabotage your father's car, we need to go to the police, Linda said. Right now. Before Marcus can what? The voice was cold, calculated. Marcus Sterling stood in the entrance with 2 security guards and a man in an expensive suit who had lawyer written all over him. Before I can protect my company from slander and corporate espionage, too late. Jake's hands tightened on the laptop. Everything I said in that server room is true. You stole my father's work, and when he found out, you killed him. Careful, the lawyer said. Those statements constitute defamation per se, actionable in civil court with significant damages. They constitute the truth, Jake shot back, and I have 3 years of documentation to prove it. Marcus smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Documentation created by a grieving child desperate to make his father's accidental death mean something. Documentation that no court would ever admit as evidence because it's stored on a laptop that you've had access to for 3 years. Who's to say you didn't create those files yourself? Plant false evidence to support your delusions? Jake felt the ground shift under him. He hadn't thought about that. About how easy it would be for Marcus's lawyers to claim the evidence was fabricated. The code itself is evidence, Lisa said, standing up. Michael's signature is embedded in every major system at Apex. Any forensic analysis would prove that Michael Carson was a talented programmer who contributed to our success, Marcus interrupted. Not that he was the sole creator. Not that his work was stolen, simply that he was part of a team I assembled, managed, and led to revolutionary breakthroughs. He turned to Jake. Your father was brilliant, but brilliance needs direction, needs vision, needs someone who understands not just how to write code, but how to build companies and change industries. That was my contribution. And if your father resented that his technical skills were subordinate to my strategic genius, well, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't make his death anything other than a tragic accident. His brakes were cut, Jake said. According to whom? Marcus asked. The police report says mechanical failure. The insurance investigation says mechanical failure. The only person claiming sabotage is a 12-year-old boy who misses his father and needs someone to blame. Jake pulled out his phone, opened a file he'd found that evening while waiting for his mother. According to the mechanic who inspected Dad's car 2 days before he died, who documented that the brakes were perfect. Who's willing to testify that the brake line failure was inconsistent with normal wear? Marcus's expression flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to show Jake that he'd hit something real. That mechanic died last year, Marcus said quietly. Heart attack. Very sad. But it means there's no one to corroborate your theory. There's me, Linda said, standing up beside her son. Michael told me someone had threatened him. Told me to take the laptop if anything happened. I was too scared to look at it. Too scared to question his death. But I'm not scared anymore. Then you're both fools, Marcus said. Because I will destroy you. Sue you for everything you have and everything you'll ever earn. Your mother will never work in this industry again. You'll be lucky to graduate high school without this following you. All because you couldn't accept that your father was a contributor, not a creator. He was a creator, Jake said. And tonight I proved it. In front of 37 witnesses, I used his code, his architecture, his emergency protocols to save your company. Protocols that only exist because Michael Carson was brilliant enough to predict exactly this kind of crisis and genius enough to build a solution you didn't even know existed. A solution I'll now patent under Apex Systems' intellectual property, Marcus said. Because you accessed our systems without authorization, which means anything you created or discovered belongs to the company, including your father's so-called emergency protocols. Jake felt sick. He'd saved the company and handed Marcus even more of his father's work to steal. Unless, Lisa said slowly, Jake didn't access the system through Apex credentials. Unless he used an external protocol that his father created independently and kept on a personal device, in which case the intellectual property belongs to Michael Carson's estate, which means it belongs to his family. Marcus's lawyer started to object, but Lisa continued. I was there when Michael developed those protocols. Watched him work on them during lunch breaks and after hours. He told me explicitly he was creating them off-network on his personal time, specifically so they wouldn't fall under Apex's IP agreements. That's convenient testimony, Marcus said, from someone who's about to lose her job for supporting corporate espionage. Fire me, Lisa said, because the moment you do, I'm going to 37 other engineers who watched Jake Carson save this company tonight. And I'm going to ask them if they think a 12-year-old could create those protocols himself, or if maybe, just maybe, his father was the genius Marcus Sterling has been pretending to be for 3 years. The silence stretched. Marcus stared at Lisa with an expression that made Jake understand exactly why his father had been so careful with his documentation. This wasn't just about stolen code. This was about a man who'd built an empire on lies and would do anything to protect those lies. I'll give you one chance, Marcus finally said, looking at Jake. Destroy that laptop. Forget everything your father told you. Accept that his death was an accident, and I'll let this go. Your mother keeps her job. You avoid legal destruction. We all move on. No, Jake said. Then you've made your choice, Marcus said, and you'll spend the rest of your life regretting it. He turned and walked back into Apex Systems, his lawyer and security guards following. Lisa stood with Jake and Linda in the cold night air, and Jake realized that saving the system had been the easy part. Proving his father was murdered and getting justice against a billionaire who controlled everything, that was going to be a lot harder. What do we do now? Linda asked. Jake looked at his father's laptop, at the documentation that could destroy Marcus Sterling if anyone would listen. We find someone who can't be bought, someone who cares more about the truth than about protecting powerful people. I might know someone, Lisa said quietly. A journalist, Catherine Morrison. She's been investigating tech industry corruption for years. If anyone would take this seriously, then we call her, Jake said, because Dad didn't document everything and leave me that letter just so I could back down the first time someone threatened us. He thought about the server room. About 37 engineers watching him prove that Michael Carson's genius was real. About Marcus Sterling's face when Jake had exposed the truth in front of everyone. Dad spent 3 years planning for this moment, Jake said, making sure I'd have everything I needed to finish what he started. I'm not going to let him down. Linda pulled her son close and Jake felt her shaking. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. Then we fight. Together. The way your father would have wanted. And in the shadow of Apex Systems, where Michael Carson had created miracles and Marcus Sterling had stolen them, his family prepared for a war that would either destroy them or finally bring justice to a man who died for discovering the truth. Catherine Morrison arrived at the small diner in Palo Alto where Lisa Chen had arranged the meeting, carrying a recorder and the kind of skepticism that came from investigating too many tech industry scandals that turned out to be elaborate hoaxes. She'd seen Jake Carson's video, the 12-year-old standing in a server room telling Marcus Sterling he'd built an empire on stolen genius. 2 million views in 18 hours. Tech blogs calling it either the most important expose in Silicon Valley history or a child's desperate fantasy. Catherine needed to know which. You're the journalist, Jake said, as Catherine sat down across from him and Linda. Not a question. A statement from someone who'd learned to recognize predators and allies. I'm someone who finds the truth, Catherine corrected. Whether that truth helps you or destroys you depends on what the evidence says. Lisa tells me you have documentation of patent theft spanning 3 years. I need to see it. Jake opened his father's laptop, turned it so Catherine could see. 3 years of files, design documents, email chains, patent applications filed by Marcus Sterling that used Michael Carson's code word for word. Catherine spent 40 minutes reading, her expression growing darker with each file. Finally, she looked up. This is either the most damning evidence of corporate fraud I've ever seen, or the most elaborate fabrication. How do I know you didn't create these files yourself? Because the code itself proves it, Lisa said. She pulled out her own laptop, opened files that showed Apex Systems' current architecture. Every major system Marcus has claimed as innovation has Michael Carson's signature embedded in the structure. The way variables are named, the commenting style, the algorithm approaches. It's like handwriting, unique, identifiable. Forensic analysis would prove Michael wrote this code. Then we do forensic analysis, Catherine said. I know experts who can examine code architecture and determine authorship. If what you're showing me is real, if Marcus Sterling really did steal a dead man's work and build an $8 billion company on it, this is bigger than tech industry scandal. This is criminal fraud and murder, Jake said quietly. My father died 2 days after confronting Marcus. The police called it mechanical failure, but the mechanic who'd just inspected the car said the brakes were perfect. That mechanic died last year, Catherine noted. I looked into it after Lisa called. A sudden medical emergency. 53 years old, no prior health issues. Collapsed at his shop 3 days after I started asking questions about your father's accident for an unrelated article. The diner went silent, except for the hum of refrigerators and distant traffic. You think Marcus killed him too? Linda whispered. I think convenient deaths around Marcus Sterling are becoming a pattern, Catherine said. Michael Carson, the mechanic, an engineer named David Park who worked with your husband and died in a house fire 6 months after Michael's accident. Another programmer, Rachel Foster, who supposedly died under suspicious circumstances after being fired for performance issues, except her family swears she was about to blow the whistle on code theft for performance issues. Except her family swears she was about to blow the whistle on code theft. Jake felt sick. How many people has he killed? I don't know, Catherine admitted. But I'm going to find out. Because if Marcus Sterling has been murdering anyone who threatened to expose his fraud, this stops being a corporate story and becomes a major criminal investigation. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then showed Jake the screen. An email from an address he didn't recognize. I was in the server room. Carson's right. Sterling doesn't understand the tech. We all saw it. If you're investigating, I'll talk. That's the 4th engineer who's contacted me since your video went viral, Catherine said. Marcus Sterling's empire is built on intimidation and NDAs, but people are starting to realize they'd rather tell the truth than protect a fraud, especially after watching a 12-year-old have more courage than they did. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop digging or your mother has an accident like your father did. He showed it to Catherine, whose expression went from serious to furious. That's a direct threat. We need to take this to the police. The police closed my father's case, Linda said bitterly. Called it mechanical failure and moved on. Why would they reopen it now? Because now you have evidence, Catherine said. Now you have witnesses. Now you have a pattern of deaths around Marcus Sterling that's hard to ignore. She pulled out her phone, started making calls. I know a detective, Jennifer Hayes. She specializes in corporate crimes that cross into criminal territory. If anyone will take this seriously, Jake's laptop chimed. An email from Rebecca Taylor, the systems analyst who'd tracked the countdown during the crisis. The subject line read, "You need to see this." Jake opened it. Inside were system logs from the night of the failure. But not just failure logs. Modification logs showing exactly when the corruption had been introduced into Apex's AI. And who had introduced it. Marcus, Jake breathed. Marcus sabotaged his own system. Lisa grabbed the laptop, scanned the logs. He embedded the corruption 3 days ago, designed it to trigger during the investor presentation, created a crisis he could solve to prove his genius. Except he couldn't solve it, Catherine said, already typing notes. Because he doesn't actually understand the technology. He needed your father's emergency protocols Marcus didn't even know existed, to save the company from a disaster he created. Why would he sabotage his own company? Linda asked. Stock manipulation, Catherine said. Create a crisis, let the stock crash, buy shares at rock bottom, then solve the crisis and profit when prices recover. It's securities fraud. SEC would nail him for decades if we can prove it. Jake's phone rang. Dr. Lisa Chen's voice was urgent. Get somewhere safe. Marcus just fired 15 engineers. Anyone who was in that server room, he's erasing witnesses. He can't fire them for witnessing something, Catherine said. That's retaliation. Illegal. He's calling it restructuring, Lisa said. But everyone knows why. And Jake, there's something else. I pulled Michael's original employment contract. He specifically negotiated that any code he developed off hours on personal equipment would remain his intellectual property. The emergency protocols you used? Legally yours. Marcus can't touch them. Jake felt something shift in his chest. His father had been protecting him 3 years ago, making sure that if anything happened, Jake would have legal ownership of the work that mattered most. "We need to move fast," Catherine said. "Before Marcus destroys more evidence or intimidates more witnesses. I'm publishing my investigation tomorrow. Every piece of evidence you've given me, every suspicious death, every fired engineer willing to talk. Marcus Sterling is going down, but we need to make sure you're protected first." Detective Jennifer Hayes arrived 20 minutes later, listened to everything, examined the evidence. "This is enough for a warrant," she said. "System logs showing sabotage, threats against minors, witness intimidation. I can have forensic accountants examining Sterling's stock trades and cybercrime specialists analyzing the code by tonight." "How long until he's arrested?" Jake asked. "If the evidence holds, and based on what I'm seeing it will, maybe days, maybe hours." Jennifer looked at Linda. "You and your son need protection. Sterling's already threatened you once. Men who kill to protect secrets don't stop just because investigations start." "We can stay at my place," Lisa offered. "Marcus doesn't know where I live." Catherine was already writing, her article taking shape. Jake watched her type, watched his father's story finally being told by someone who had the platform and credibility to make people listen. "Your father left you everything you needed," Catherine said, looking up from her laptop. "The code, the documentation, the legal protections. He knew Marcus would come after him, so he made sure you'd have the weapons to finish the fight." Jake thought about Michael Carson sitting in this same diner 3 years ago, typing letters to a 9-year-old son, preparing for a battle he wouldn't survive but making certain his family would win. Marcus Sterling spent 3 years thinking he'd gotten away with it, Jake said quietly, thinking nobody could touch him. But he didn't count on Dad planning for this moment. Didn't count on me finding the evidence. Didn't count on people like you and Lisa having the courage to stand up to him. His phone buzzed again. Another threat. Another attempt to scare a 12-year-old into silence. Jake deleted it without reading it completely. "I'm not scared anymore," he said. "Because Dad wasn't building an emergency protocol for the system. He was building one for us, for this exact moment when Marcus thought he was untouchable." Catherine smiled. "Then let's show him what happens when you underestimate a dead man's love for his son." And in a diner in Palo Alto, while Marcus Sterling's empire began cracking under the weight of truth it couldn't suppress, Michael Carson's final gift to his family started dismantling everything built on his stolen genius. The FBI arrived at Marcus Sterling's Palo Alto mansion at 6 a.m., 3 days after Catherine Morrison's article hit the New York Times with a headline that destroyed everything. "Tech billionaire built empire on stolen code and murder, how Marcus Sterling silenced the witnesses." Jake watched the live news coverage from Lisa Chen's apartment, his mother's arm around his shoulders, as federal agents led Marcus Sterling out in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed. The man who'd screamed, "Get that boy out of here," looked smaller now, older, like someone watching their carefully constructed lies collapse in real time. "They found everything," Detective Jennifer Hayes said, standing in Lisa's living room with files that represented 3 days of forensic investigation. The stock trades Marcus made the day before he sabotaged the system, the offshore accounts where he'd been hiding money, the encrypted communications with a contractor who specializes in making accidents look natural. Linda's hand tightened on Jake's shoulder. "He really did kill Michael. He actually murdered my husband. The brake line on your husband's car was cut with professional precision," Jennifer said gently. "We exhumed the mechanic who'd inspected it, found traces of a rare toxin that mimics heart attack symptoms, David Park's house fire, accelerant patterns consistent with arson. Rachel Foster's death. A later review suggested it may not have been what it first appeared." Jake felt tears burning his eyes. 4 people. Marcus Sterling had murdered 4 people to protect his stolen empire. "How many years will he get?" Jake asked. "If convicted on all charges?" "Life without parole," Jennifer said. "Securities fraud, corporate espionage, 4 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence is overwhelming. Your father's documentation, the forensic code analysis proving authorship, the system logs showing deliberate sabotage, the financial records. Marcus Sterling is never getting out of prison." Catherine Morrison's second article had published that morning, this one detailing the arrest and including interviews with all 15 engineers Marcus had fired. Every single one testified that Marcus Sterling didn't understand the technology he claimed to have invented. that they'd watched a 12-year-old save the company using code Marcus couldn't even comprehend. "The tech world is imploding," Lisa said, scrolling through her phone. 7 major investors have pulled out of Apex. The board is voting today on whether to remove Sterling's name from everything. And Jake, she turned her phone so he could see, MIT just announced they're offering you a full scholarship. Early admission to their computer science program when you're ready. Jake stared at the email. 4 years ago, his father had dreamed of Jake attending MIT someday, had talked about how they'd celebrate together when the acceptance letter came. And now Jake had the opportunity, but his father wasn't here to see it. "There's something else," Jennifer said. She pulled out a document, handed it to Linda. "We found Michael's original patent applications, the ones he filed before Marcus stole the ideas. They're dated, notarized, legally solid, which means every patent Marcus has claimed for the past 3 years is void. And all the royalties, all the licensing fees, all the profits from those patents, legally, they belong to Michael Carson's estate." Linda read the document twice, her face going pale. This says the intellectual property is worth over $200 million. Conservative estimate, Jennifer said. Could be closer to $500 million when you factor in future earnings. Marcus Sterling built his fortune on your husband's genius. The courts are going to transfer that fortune to the people he stole it from. Jake couldn't process it. $200 million. Maybe $500 million. His mother, who'd worked 2 jobs for 3 years just to keep them afloat, was suddenly wealthier than she could imagine. "I don't want his money," Linda said, her voice shaking. "I want my husband back. I want Jake to have his father. Money doesn't fix what Marcus took from us." "No," Jennifer agreed. "But it does mean you never have to struggle again. That Jake can go to any school he wants. That Michael Carson's work, his actual work with his name on it, will be recognized for the genius it was." Jake's phone buzzed. An email from Thomas Chen, one of the engineers who'd been in the server room that night. The subject line read, "You were right about everything." Jake opened it. "Jake, I owe you an apology. We all do. We watched Marcus Sterling take credit for innovations we knew he didn't create. We saw him humiliate junior engineers and steal their ideas. We suspected something was wrong, but were too scared to speak up. Then you, a 12-year-old kid, walked into that server room and had the courage we didn't have. You exposed the truth. You got justice for your father. And you showed 37 cowards what bravery actually looks like. Thank you. We're all testifying at the trial. Every single one of us." Lisa read over Jake's shoulder, tears in her eyes. "Michael would be so proud of you. Not just for being brilliant. He always knew you were brilliant. But for having the courage to stand up when everyone else was too afraid." The news coverage switched to footage from Apex Systems headquarters, where employees were removing Marcus Sterling's name from the building, his portrait in the lobby being taken down, his office being cleared out. 3 years of claiming credit for another man's genius, erased in a single morning. "The board is offering you something," Lisa said carefully. "They want to rename the company Carson Systems. Put Michael's portrait where Marcus's used to hang. Establish a foundation in his name to support young programmers from working-class backgrounds. They're trying to make amends for not stopping Marcus sooner." "Will it bring Dad back?" Jake asked quietly. "No," Lisa admitted. "Nothing will. But it means your father's legacy won't be forgotten. That every programmer who walks into that building will see his name and know that brilliance doesn't require wealth or credentials, just courage and genius and the refusal to let powerful people steal what you've created." Catherine Morrison called. "Turn on Channel 7. They're interviewing Marcus." Jake grabbed the remote, switched channels. Marcus Sterling sat in an orange jumpsuit across from a reporter, looking like someone who'd aged 10 years in 3 days. "Do you have anything to say to Jake Carson and his family?" the reporter asked. Marcus stared at the camera. For a moment, Jake thought he might apologize, might acknowledge what he'd done, might show some hint of remorse for murdering 4 people and destroying countless lives. The boy got lucky, Marcus said instead. Had access to his father's old work and managed to convince people it was more significant than it actually was. Michael Carson was a competent programmer. Nothing more. The real innovations at Apex came from... The interview cut off as FBI agents removed Marcus from the room, his lawyer shouting about media restrictions and pretrial statements. He still doesn't get it, Jake said. Even with everything proven, with forensic evidence and witness testimony and his own system logs showing he sabotaged the company, he still can't admit Dad was smarter than him. Because admitting it would mean accepting that his entire identity was a lie, Catherine said over the phone. That he's not a genius, not a visionary, just a thief who got caught by a 12-year-old using his dead father's code. Linda pulled Jake close. Your father left you more than documentation and emergency protocols. He left you the proof that integrity matters more than wealth. That truth eventually wins even when liars seem untouchable. That one person with courage can expose corruption that everyone else is too scared to confront. Jake thought about that night in the server room. About 37 engineers watching him save a company using code Marcus couldn't understand. About the moment he'd turned to Marcus and said, "You built a billion-dollar company on a dead man's genius, and I just proved it to everyone in this room." He'd been terrified, shaking, certain that Marcus would destroy them. Instead, Marcus had destroyed himself by underestimating a 12-year-old who'd spent 3 years studying his father's work, by assuming nobody would have the courage to challenge a billionaire's lies, by believing that power and money could suppress truth forever. "When's the trial?" Jake asked. 6 months, Jennifer said. "But with the evidence we have, Marcus's lawyers are already discussing plea deals. They know they can't win. Best they can hope for is life in prison and the harshest possible sentence for multiple murders." Jake's phone buzzed again. An email from Dr. Patricia Donovan, the lead forensic code analyst who'd examined Michael Carson's work. The subject line, "Your father was extraordinary." Jake opened it. "Jake, I've analyzed code architecture for 20 years, examined work from the best programmers in the world. Your father's code is the most elegant, efficient, brilliant structure I've ever seen. The emergency protocols he designed weren't just functional, they were poetry. Every line served multiple purposes. Every algorithm was optimized beyond anything I've encountered. Marcus Sterling could have worked for 100 years and never created something 1/10 as sophisticated as what Michael Carson did on his lunch breaks. Your father was a once-in-a-generation genius. I'm sorry the world didn't recognize it while he was alive. But everyone knows now. His work will be studied for decades. His name will be remembered long after Marcus Sterling is forgotten." Jake read the email 3 times, tears streaming down his face, and finally let himself feel something he hadn't allowed in 3 years. Pride. Not just in what his father had accomplished, but in what Jake himself had done to make sure that accomplishment wasn't buried with stolen patents and murdered witnesses. "What happens to Apex now?" Jake asked. "The board wants to rebuild," Lisa said. "Bring back the 15 engineers Marcus fired. Implement your father's original designs instead of Marcus's corrupted versions. And they want you involved. Not as an employee, you're 12, but as a consultant. Someone who understands Michael Carson's work better than anyone alive." "Would Dad want that?" Jake asked. "Would he want me spending time at the company that let Marcus kill him?" Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Your father loved that company before Marcus corrupted it. Loved the idea of building technology that helped people. I think he'd want you to reclaim it, to turn it into what he always hoped it could be." Jake looked at his father's laptop, still sitting on the coffee table where he'd left it after showing Jennifer the evidence. 3 years ago, Michael Carson had sat in his home office encrypting files and writing letters to a 9-year-old son, preparing for a battle he knew he might not survive, but he'd made certain his son would win. "Okay," Jake said. "I'll help them rebuild, but on one condition." "What's that?" Lisa asked. "Every programmer who works there has to sign a contract that says any code they develop on their own time belongs to them, not the company. Not some billionaire who thinks he deserves credit for other people's genius. Them. The way Dad's contract should have protected him." Lisa smiled through tears. Michael would love that. Protecting the next generation of programmers from what happened to him. The news switched to footage of Marcus Sterling being transferred to federal custody, no longer a billionaire tech visionary. Just another criminal who'd gotten caught because he underestimated the power of truth and the courage of a child who refused to let his father's murder go unpunished. And Jake Carson, 12 years old, clutching his father's laptop, surrounded by people who'd chosen truth over convenience, watched Marcus Sterling disappear into a system that would make certain he never hurt anyone again. The trial lasted 3 weeks, But the verdict took the jury only 4 hours. Jake sat in the courtroom between his mother and Lisa Chen, watching Marcus Sterling stand as the judge read the charges. Securities fraud, corporate espionage, 4 counts of first-degree murder. The man who'd built an $8 billion empire on stolen genius looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of truth he could no longer deny. Guilty on all counts, the judge said, and Jake felt 3 years of grief finally begin to transform into something else. Not happiness. His father was still gone. But justice. The knowledge that Michael Carson's murder hadn't gone unpunished. That the man who'd stolen his work and his life would spend the rest of his existence in prison. Linda squeezed Jake's hand, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness this time. Something closer to relief. The vindication of knowing she'd been right to suspect the accident wasn't accidental. That her husband's death had meant something beyond random tragedy. Life without possibility of parole, the judge continued. 4 consecutive sentences. Mr. Sterling, you will die in prison. This court hopes that gives some measure of peace to the families you destroyed. Marcus turned, his eyes finding Jake in the courtroom. For a moment, Jake thought he might finally apologize, might acknowledge what he'd done. Instead, Marcus's expression was pure hatred, the look of someone who'd been defeated by a 12-year-old and would never forgive the humiliation. Jake met his gaze steadily. You don't get to intimidate me anymore, he said quietly, knowing Marcus couldn't hear, but needing to say it anyway. Dad made sure of that. Catherine Morrison's article about the verdict went viral within hours. 5 million views. 10 million. Tech blogs, news networks, social media platforms. Everyone sharing the story of how a 12-year-old had exposed a billionaire's fraud and solved his father's murder using nothing but courage and the code his father had left behind. The next morning, Jake stood outside the building that now bore his father's name, Carson Systems. Michael Carson's portrait hung in the lobby where Marcus Sterling's had been, his father smiling in the photograph, looking proud and brilliant and alive in a way Jake hadn't seen in 3 years. Ready? Lisa asked. She'd been appointed interim CEO while the board searched for permanent leadership. The first thing she'd done was rehire all 15 engineers Marcus had fired and establish a fund to support families of his victims. Ready, Jake said. They walked through doors his father had walked through every day for 12 years, past the portrait, into the building that had been built on Michael Carson's genius, but would finally give him credit for it. The engineering department erupted in applause when Jake entered. 37 people who'd watched him save their company, plus the 15 Marcus had fired, plus dozens more who'd heard the story and wanted to meet the kid who'd taken down a billionaire with nothing but his father's laptop and the courage to tell the truth. Thomas Chen approached first. Jake Carson, I owe you an apology 3 years overdue. Your father was brilliant. We all knew it. And we should have spoken up when Marcus started taking credit for his work. We were cowards. You weren't. Thank you. One by one, engineers approached, apologizing, thanking him, sharing stories about Michael Carson, how he'd helped them debug impossible problems, how he'd stayed late to mentor junior programmers, how he'd made everyone around him better through his kindness and genius. He would have loved this, Linda said, standing beside Jake as the tributes continued. Not the recognition. He never cared about that. But knowing his work would be used to help people instead of padding a fraud's bank account, that would have mattered to him. Rebecca Taylor presented Jake with something wrapped in cloth. We found this in storage. Your father's original workstation. Every line of code he ever wrote for this company, preserved exactly as he left it. We're setting it up as a memorial in the main engineering lab. So every programmer who works here will see what real genius looks like. Jake unwrapped it carefully. His father's mechanical keyboard, worn smooth from 12 years of typing, coffee stains on the desk, sticky notes with algorithm sketches in Michael's distinctive handwriting, the physical evidence of a brilliant mind at work. Can I see his files? Jake asked. Rebecca led him to a terminal, pulled up directories Jake had never known existed, thousands of files, projects his father had worked on, code he'd written, comments he'd left for future programmers explaining his thinking, and there, buried in a folder labeled, For Jake, when you're ready, a video file. Jake's hands shook as he clicked it. His father's face filled the screen, recorded 3 years ago, 2 days before the car accident, before Marcus Sterling had cut his brake lines and murdered him on a mountain road. "Hey, buddy," Michael said, and Jake's throat closed up hearing his father's voice again. "If you're watching this, something happened to me, and I'm sorry. Sorry I couldn't be there to see you grow up. Sorry I couldn't protect you and your mom, but I want you to understand something important." Michael leaned closer to the camera. "I knew Marcus was stealing my work. Knew he was dangerous. Could have stayed quiet, kept my head down, let him take credit for everything I created. Would have been safer, easier. But then what would I be teaching you? That it's okay to let powerful people steal from you? That truth doesn't matter as long as you're comfortable?" He shook his head. "No, I documented everything because I wanted you to know that integrity matters more than safety, that standing up to liars is worth the risk, that one person with courage can expose corruption everyone else is too scared to confront." Jake wiped tears from his eyes as his father continued. "You're 9 years old right now, brilliant, kind, brave in ways you don't even understand yet. By the time you see this, you'll be older, maybe 12, maybe 15, maybe 20. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you'll have the tools you need to finish what I started." Michael held up a laptop, the same one Jake had been carrying for 3 years. "Everything's in here. Every patent he stole. Every line of code I wrote. Every piece of evidence you'll need. And more than that, I left you the emergency protocols, the backdoor access, the proof that I understood this technology better than Marcus ever will." His father's expression softened. "I know this is a lot to put on a kid. Unfair to make you fight battles I should have finished. But Jake, I believe in you. Believe you're strong enough to handle this. Brave enough to stand up when adults won't. Smart enough to use what I've given you to get justice." Michael paused, his eyes bright with tears. "Tell your mom I love her. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't stay. And Jake, remember that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. Even when powerful people threaten you. Even when it would be easier to stay quiet." He smiled. "You've got this, buddy. I made sure of it. Now go show the world what happens when you underestimate a Carson." The video ended. Jake sat staring at the blank screen, surrounded by engineers who'd watched him receive his father's final message. Linda was crying. Lisa was crying. Thomas Chen wiped his eyes and looked away. He knew. Jake whispered. 3 years ago, he knew exactly what would happen. And he prepared for it, prepared me for it, made sure I'd have everything I needed. He was protecting you, Linda said. The only way he could, by giving you the weapons to fight back after he was gone. Jake thought about that night in the server room. About standing in front of Marcus Sterling and 37 witnesses, using his father's code to save a company that had let Marcus steal everything. About the moment he'd turned to Marcus and said, "You built a billion-dollar company on a dead man's genius, and I just proved it to everyone in this room." He'd been terrified, shaking, certain he'd lose, but his father had made certain he'd win. "I have a decision to make," Jake said, pulling out his phone to show the MIT acceptance letter that had been sitting unanswered for a week. "They want me to start a special program next year. Early admission, full scholarship, study with the best computer scientists in the world." "That's incredible," Lisa said. "Your father would be so proud." "But they also want me here," Jake continued, gesturing at Carson Systems, "as a consultant, helping rebuild what Dad created, making sure his work is used the right way." "You can't do both," Linda said gently. "MIT is in Massachusetts. This is California. You'd have to choose." Jake looked at his father's workstation, at the keyboard worn smooth by brilliant hands, at the sticky notes with algorithm sketches that showed a genius mind at work, at the portrait in the lobby of a man who died protecting his family. "Dad didn't leave me those protocols just to save one company," Jake said slowly. "He left them to teach me something bigger. That knowledge is power. That truth matters. That one person with courage can change things everyone else accepts as broken." He turned to face the room full of engineers. "I'm 12 years old. I'll go to MIT when I'm ready. Study everything Dad wanted me to learn. But right now, what I want is to make sure what happened to him doesn't happen to anyone else." Jake pulled up the contract Lisa had mentioned, the one protecting programmers' intellectual property rights. "Every company in tech needs this. Every programmer needs protection from the next Marcus Sterling. So I'm not just going to fix this company. I'm going to help fix the entire industry. Thomas Chen nodded slowly. You want to create a standard, a set of protections that become industry-wide. I want to create what Dad would have created if he'd lived, Jake said. A system where programmers own their work, where brilliance gets credit, where 12-year-olds don't have to fight billionaires in court because their fathers were murdered for being too talented. The room erupted in conversation, engineers pulling out laptops, suggesting clauses, debating implementations, and Jake stood at the center of it, using his father's legacy to build something that would protect the next generation. This is going to change everything, Catherine Morrison said. She'd arrived to cover Jake's first day, but now she was recording something bigger. You're not just vindicating your father. You're using what he taught you to reform an entire industry. That's what heroes do, Jake said simply. They don't just win their own battles. They make sure the next person doesn't have to fight the same war. Linda pulled her son close, looking at Michael's portrait. He'd be so proud, not just of what you accomplished, but of who you're becoming. Jake looked at the engineers working around him, at the building that now bore his father's name, at the movement. He was starting to protect programmers from the corruption that had killed Michael Carson. Dad left me more than code, Jake said. He left me a mission, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure he didn't die for nothing. As the sun set over Palo Alto, Carson Systems hummed with the energy of people building something that mattered. And Jake Carson, 12 years old, carrying his father's laptop, surrounded by people who'd chosen courage over convenience, began transforming personal tragedy into systemic change. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you inspire others to build.